Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Hope you're all doing good. It is a cool and slightly wet morning here in the Pacific Northwest. We had a couple days of 80s and now it's back to rain. Hopefully you got some good weather and you can get out, play with your vehicles, wash them, work on them, do something. Anyway, have fun with them, the important part. So today we're going to talk about water methanol injection. One of the viewers asked what my personal theories and approach was, independent of the ECU being used. So we're going to break it down into the three ways you can do it. Well, I guess there's more than that. We're going to start with the three ways you can do the fuel, which would be straight water methanol, usually a 50-50 mix or some blend, and then straight methanol. And then obviously the two types of delivery we could do in an intercooler pipe, we can do direct port. So we're going to kind of go over what approach and why you might do it. Not necessarily what's right or wrong, because I think there's a lot of experience that some people will have that I don't for using a certain approach. So far be it for me to say that it's the wrong way to do it. It's just different. So we're just going to kind of cover some of the basic things and go from there. So let's open up some software just so we have something to look at besides this beautiful GT3 RS and get started. So the example that we're going to use happens to be a pump gas 2JZ with a fairly large turbo. It had a Precision 6870. You may remember it from past episodes where we talked about knot control and kind of some of the things that I ran into tuning the 2J as well as launch control. So if you look at the highlighted line, that's 240 kPa, which is just over 20 pounds of boost for the rest of us. Typically I use kPa for boost because it's easy math for me, even though I'm used to SAE like most Americans. At any rate, when we start looking at the numbers, looks pretty basic. If you tuned many 4G63s, it's just a slight bit higher than what you would probably be at 20 pounds on one of those, but you know, kind of gives you an idea of how it relates to other cars. Maybe a 4B11, it would be fairly similar to a 4B11. So this did have a big turbo. It had a 6870. It was a twin scroll, but did pretty decent on spool. So for sake of discussion, we're going to pretend that this spooled at 4,000 RPM. And right there you see 6.5 degrees, if that's where it was fully in. Likely it wasn't, but again, we're just using this as a demonstrator. By the time we get to 5,500, that's ramped up another 4.5 degrees. We're at 10.5. And by the time we get to 7,500, which is the highest I revved this, we're at 15. So not too bad. I do believe that I actually went higher in the end. I think I might have gone almost to 260 kPa. And seemingly it was not free. I did the timing sweeps, everything seemed happy. But as you can see, that's just the line above, so half degree out or so. Down low where it's going to make peak torque, it is more, but that's normal tuning. So now let's switch to the alternate map for the meth injection, and we're going to see some big differences right away that we need to talk about, and then we're going to get into more of the science after we do that. I made the numbers a little bit bigger so they're easier to see. But if we jump to that same 240 kPa as an example, 4,000 RPM, it's still 6.5 degrees. 5,500, now it's 2 degrees higher, it's 12.5. 7,500, it's 17.5, so 2.5 degrees there. What I have found in most of how I use methanol, because you can get really aggressive on it if you want, which again is different than how I tune. I normally am only looking to add 5-6 pounds of boost and make as much power as I can without going crazy. I keep the timing kind of what you would do on E85. Don't really change peak torque. Just start ramping it in out the top. Make your power with the boost more than the timing, especially on stock engines. If you're on a stock ECU, you're going to run into some really specific issues that if your methanol failed and you don't have a good way to do a fail-safe, your car could be really high timing, really high boost, and likely lean. Um, Again, we're gonna get into that as we go, the air fuel targets and some more of the science. But if you leave your timing more or less where it is, you aren't limiting the ECU's ability to use the knot control in case that happens. If you run out of methanol, water methanol or water, uh, and you're way past where you would be on pump gas, you have to kind of leave yourself some sort of safety blankets. Some meth kits have fail safes. They will force your boost control solenoid to uh, wastegate line by grounding it out. Depending on if you have a combination of AEM gauges, as an example, you can do lean protection in the in the wideband, and if you're at X amount of boost and leaner than a certain target, it will you can use it to trigger a relay and create a fail safe that way so that you're not going to damage the engine. But with anything, when you have an additional system, you have to be sure that you inspect it occasionally, make sure it's working, make sure it's spraying, so that you're not going to run into a potential situation of engine damage, because we're really using the water methanol for the most part to prevent engine damage in the first place by making up for bad octane, or we just don't have access to the ethanol, and so you need to do something to have a little bit more fun with the car and go from, the 240 kPa to maybe 300 kPa. So you want to go from 20 pounds to 30 pounds, 29 pounds. So you have to do something to get that octane in there. Race gas is expensive. We all know that. So water methanol ends up being a pretty easy way to do it. So now let's talk a little bit about the AFRs, and then we're going to talk about the different mixes that we can use, and inject the meth injection placement, um, so that we kind of know what we're talking about. This particular car on pump gas, I left a little bit on the rich side just to make sure that EGT stayed low. I didn't know how the car was going to be driven. No reason to get greedy, because we're going to do things to have more fun later. So nothing really exciting there. But now when you are bringing in the methanol, we're going to start with 100% methanol first. Typically what you'll find is that if you have tuned your car for an 11.8 air fuel on gasoline, where you're going to be the safest, and again, you can play with this, but where you're going to be the safest is if you don't touch that map at all, and you let it run at a full point richer. This is going to mostly apply to open loop, wide open throttle situations like a stock ECU. So let's say Subaru or Evo, something like that. Even some of the Fords using HP tuners. You're gonna, the older ones that is, um, you're gonna just let the methanol run at rich, which isn't gonna hurt the power. It adds some of that fail-safe that we were talking about, because if the methanol pump ever did die, it's only going to go back to an 11.8. Versus if you tuned it on the edge at an 11.8 or an 11.9 air fuel, and then the meth failed, you might be a 12.9 or a 13.0. It will take almost no time at all for engine damage to occur. So staying on the richer side while the meth is being used is important. Now, there are certain caveats to that. If you're running 50-50 mix, or you're running 100%, that's usually going to be the case. If you're going to use straight water, which I personally don't recommend, but if you're going to use straight water, there's a few things that you have to make sure you're doing to keep that functioning. Number one, water does not burn. I've heard some people say water is infinite octane, and well, maybe that's true in the English definition because octane is a resistance to burn. In a combustion engine, that's irrelevant. Water puts out the fire. So if you're spraying pure water, what you will find is you have to lean the car out a significant amount to keep it from misfiring. The other thing is you have to have a combination that is less than ideal, um, that has high intake air temps, maybe because you're pushing the turbo too far, you don't have enough intercooler. It's just not possible to have an intercooler with good airflow and still have cooling to the radiator, whatever the situation might be. Typically, what I've found, and this is straight water and to an extent even water methanol, depending on the mixture, 50-50 and above, you're okay. But below that, this kind of applies. You really need a situation where your intake air temps are going to be at least 140 degrees. AEM says that. Um, Obviously, water doesn't turn to steam until 212 degrees or 100 degrees Celsius, but at 140 degree intake air temp, if you've ever been around a swamp cooler or misters, let's say you live in the Southwest, you live in Nevada or you live in Arizona, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That water mist does a lot to take the temp out. But if you did it on cold air, 100 degree air maybe, um, but you can't inject much because of its ability to absorb the latent heat. Um, you're just going to get wet. You're going to get cold. Now, if it was 120 out and you're sitting in some cafe having a iced coffee or whatever, and they have those going because you wanted to be outside, sure, you might feel good. I know the couple places in Boulder City, Nevada, I've been to have water misters as you wait outside because of the line, and you feel comfortable. It can be a 90-degree day and you don't really notice it. Now, inside the engine, though, we have 140 degree, 150 degree air in a less than ideal situation. Maybe you have a top mount and low speed, you don't have enough airflow to it. Um, the straight water is really going to be fairly effective, especially as it mixes with the fuel, gets in the combustion chamber. Combustion chamber starts to heat it up even more. That water is going to hit 212. It's going to hit 700 degrees, which is super critical. 705, I believe, Fahrenheit. Disassociate, and it's going to have done the most it could to take the temp out. But in most practical applications, we don't build our cars the wrong way. We have a decent sized intercooler. Maybe our ambient air temp is 80 to 110 degrees, but realistically, if the intercooler is working, you're only going to be slightly over that. Maybe you're going to be 125, 130. I still strongly suggest that if you're going to use meth injection, use 50-50 at a minimum. It adds fuel value. It does add octane uh, in the cylinder. And then if you can and you maintain your system and use it regularly, use 100%. You're just adding fuel. It it will help in a lot of situations, and you can run it pretty much as rich as you want. My Nissan, as an example, I would run a 10.5 air fuel. It was hot piped, so the main reason it was there was specifically to act as the intercooler. So I had all of the intake air temp at 16 pounds. I was probably over 200 degrees. I'd assume 210 maybe. That would be a situation where straight water would work great. I have access to methanol. I just ran the methanol. So that brings us into the next part of it, which is the mixes that we would do. When you start to think about the percentage of mixture that you want to run in your application, one thing that's very important is that methanol is corrosive if left to sit. it seems that if the more you use it, you don't have as many problems. And depending on the meth kit you have, it might start at 7 psi at 50 kPa of boost and be all in by 14 and a half or 20. It, so you're going to be constantly putting it in. That can make using straight methanol fairly expensive if you don't have easy access to it. Alternative mixtures that we found to work very effectively are denatured alcohol, which is a little bit more, but you can get it at like any hardware store usually, um, because it's used in painting and varnishing and that type of stuff. So it's 30% isopropyl alcohol and 70% ethanol, I believe, some mix like that. I'm not a chemist, so I'm sure I will get corrected by somebody. Uh, you can run that straight. If you run it 50-50, you will have to run it a little bit leaner because it doesn't burn quite the same. Alternatively, if you don't have a big enough fuel system, but you do have access to ethanol, you can use ethanol. I would use E98 specifically. Then your fueling is going to look more like just a normal gas motor. You're going to want to be running like an 1150 or an 1160, kind of like you see in the upper left corner here. When you look around for other uh, brands, some people will use washer fluid. They'll use the 80/20 or whatever the low temp winter blend washing fluid is because it has 20 to 30% methanol in it. VP sells their boost juice or whatever their particular name for it is. I probably messed that up. I believe it has C85 in it or whatever their mix of uh, secret herbs and spices is, that it's ethanol based, it's green. Works really well, actually. I believe it is fairly expensive. I believe it's $10 a gallon. So, again, how much you're going to use is important. But realistically, you can put a lot of different chemicals into the engine that will combust. Again, I really don't think that straight water, unless you're going to run a lot of boost, maybe you're going to be like my friend Walker and you're going to run 40 plus pounds of boost. There, you're going to have the heat. You can take advantage of it, and him and some of his friends have made that work, and that's great. Because they can just get distilled water. They can get it from a tap if they wanted. Water everywhere. Makes it very convenient, very inexpensive as well. So I can't really tell you what to mix. I prefer running 100% methanol for the most part. It can be very hard on the methanol pump when it sits. It Depending on where you have the nozzle placed, it it is going to have some other things that it can do, and we'll get into that with the nozzles um, when we get to that section. But you have to think about corrosion. Um, for stuff you're going to use all the time, though, 50-50 is really safe. It's what AEM recommends for their kits. I believe Snow as well. So lots of potential places that you can buy the methanol, or substances, I should say, that you can use in the engine. Hopefully that kind of was clear enough to give you guys ideas what you can use. But denatured alcohol has proven to be very stable, non-corrosive, no issues with pump life, and really seems to be readily available. So that's the one that I normally will uh, tell customers to get. We have easy access to ethanol, so we don't do pump meth much, but there are certainly times that we do. And, when we do 50-50 on a car that is making, let's say, 400 horse, I recommend only only looking to add with the methanol somewhere between 15 and 20% of your total power. That's what I would consider aggressive. So if you're going to do the less aggressive, you might only be 50 or 60 horse. So maybe you're only going to be 12.5% of what your power is that you're going to add in the methanol, um, just to cover up the imperfections in tune or gas quality. Certainly there's crazy things you can do. I know people that would switch to 87 octane and then run lots and lots of meth injection. Not sure if it mathed out, but that's what they did for cost savings. Maybe if they were doing 50-50. Your results may vary though, not necessarily something I would recommend. So lastly, we're going to talk about injector placement, where we normally see it, and some of the things that can happen depending on where it's at. So these are snow meth nozzles in a 2.7 or 3.0 EcoBoost plastic intake manifold. I need to clean it up a little bit. I still have some adjustments to make it pretty. But as you can see, that's in the runners. It's low. That is what is going to be referred to as direct port. Typically, it's a little more expensive. It's pretty common on DI stuff because injectors and fuel pump are expensive, but adding it in a port in some fashion, whether you do actual port injection or you do meth injection, you can extend your fuel system, max out your stock turbos or smaller turbos, and be safe about it, have a lot of fun. This particular one is going to go on my Explorer ST. I have a crazy experiment I'm going to do using a fuel injection mixing block from Joe Blow Speed Shop in Australia, and basically I'm going to use these as the nozzles into the injection, but I'm going to use a standard high impedance injector remotely mounted, and the meth injector will be the atomizer. But more or less, we're just going to put E85 into the ports. Now, the option is putting it into an intercooler pipe. So let's switch to that real quick. And I just so happen to have an intercooler. So the other location is typically the upper intercooler pipe, and this one is also for my Explorer. This came from Fen Fabrications. Really nice piece. And things that you have to keep in mind: you don't want the injector, if you had a blow-off valve, obviously most people would probably have a blow-off valve about right here. I'm using the factory one that is located in a different area. Upper intercooler pipe doesn't actually have it. So you would want to be on the throttle body side of your blow-off valve, because you don't want to spray that randomly out of the blow-off valve when it opens up. If you're a manual, an automatic, obviously it's not going to open while it shifts, but you might still get situations where it would spray out of it. So definitely stay upstream of the blow-off valve. The other thing is you do want somewhere between 12 to 18 inches, so 30 to 45 centimeters from the throttle body, because we want to give it some time to atomize. You typically will want it in a straight section when possible, because you want it to be traveling evenly through the pipe. Hopefully your intake manifold will be designed for wet flow, or at least even air distribution. Now that's a really important thing to look at. Other people have covered this. Engine Masters, which is part of the Motor Trend on Demand, did a test on an LS. Because those are not designed for wet flow, they were observing distribution issues. So one reason to not get greedy and have a big, huge, massive amount of meth going through an intercooler pipe, because you might get cylinders that are richer or leaner, and leaner obviously will damage things. So again, going back to what I said earlier, 50 to 80 horse typically for a single nozzle in the pipe. Past that, you're going to strongly consider direct port so that you have even flow. So one other reason to consider direct port, if you're going to do it, it is a little more expensive because you have lines and you have more nozzles. But anytime you have an air fuel charge moving through the pipe, that means that it has gotten into your vacuum system. So blow-off valves, wastegates, anything that is going to have air moving through it at any point is also going to have that water methanol or straight methanol introduced into it. Now, because things like wastegates and blow-off valves are a dead-end system. If you made the mistake of running your car hard, turning it off, and then maybe you're going on vacation for 3 months, or you're in the military and you deploy, I have seen cases where the wastegate diaphragms will start to disintegrate, corrode, create issues. Blow-off valves get sticky depending on the blow-off valve. Um, you can actually do lots of damage to other systems because you've allowed that into those vacuum lines. So some kind of an air dryer, the little thing that looks like a dreidel that comes with HKS parts, is actually an air dryer. I'm sure you can get those uh, various other parts, like a little spin and top. You can get those on Amazon, I'm sure. But you'll want to do something to try to prevent that if you do direct port and a high percentage of methanol. More likely 100% versus 50-50 or less. But one thing to definitely keep in mind, methanol eats aluminum. So your wastegate hat is aluminum. The blow-off valve hat is aluminum. Usually the blow-off valve is entirely aluminum other than the bolts. So definitely a lot of things you can do in a negative way if you're not careful. So direct port has advantages there. It has better distribution on most modern intake manifolds. And really, you can get a little greedier there because it's like adding, well, in the case of the Explorer, 6 more injectors. So instead of just having, a set of 500cc equivalent sitting in the head, um, or whatever they really truly math out at in lower pressure numbers, um, you can have 1000cc port injection per cylinder and realistically make all the horsepower that you'd ever want. Most meth jets are available, I think, down to like 50 cc's, 100 cc's, something like that. And the ones that are currently in this manifold are 1000 to match the injector. But, that just seemed easy math because of how I'm using it, where I'm not typically using it as meth injection. Um, so, anyway, I hope that covers the subject. I realize I kind of had to bounce around a lot. You may have to rewatch this one. I apologize in advance, but you'll definitely have fun with the methanol as long as you use it safely. Anyway, guys, hope you're all doing well. Take care. We'll talk to you later.